Hi, my name is Matthew Miller, and today for my course, U.S. History 1865 to Present, I wanted to talk to you guys about a topic that's somewhat controversial, and this would fit into one of my modules pertaining to the tumultuous 60s and leading into the civil rights era. So, mostly I want to talk to you about a person today, and that's Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. So, in respect to Richard Nixon, um, you would you could view him through two different lenses. You could view him as the president who enacted several policies that were extremely beneficial to the country, and then you could view him as a man who broke the law and was set to face trial in Senate before he ultimately resigned. So first, I want to pose this question: what exactly is the role of a president? Perhaps it's a figurehead, somebody who is the face of the United States when dealing with foreign dignitaries, when dealing with foreign affairs, to calm the nation, to speak in front of them. Is it a leader? Is it someone who steps up and takes action, who dictates policy? Is it somebody who's autonomous, who basically they're the man in charge or the woman in charge? They are the person who tells everybody what's what. Or are they beholden to the public? They should enact policies strictly because the public wants them, because voters wanted them. However, that may seem fit. Well, George Washington, our first president, believed in Congress having the power. So he, in essence, was the CEO who put things into effect. Probably most tantamount to the figurehead role. So, using that, let's take a look at Richard Nixon. Nixon takes office, and his platform was to reform the draft system. Um, he wanted to make the draft system perhaps a little bit more fair. He wanted to limit it in a sense. Also, he wanted to give South Vietnam a bigger role in the war, and this was called Vietnamization. So essentially, rather than the United States bearing the brunt of the war, we would train South Vietnamese soldiers to really fight their own battle. This was a policy that was very much supported by Americans. And then the next platform was expanding bombing of enemy territory, which would lead to protests. Because actually, how do you step back from the war in Vietnam when you're training the South Vietnamese soldiers to do the fighting, but at the same time expanding your aerial assaults of North Vietnam? So it seems like a little bit of a conundrum right there. So, in addition to the protests about that, there were protests on college campuses. There was Jackson State, where 2 students were killed. There was Kent State, where 4 people were killed and 9 were wounded. And so, obviously, this was a very tumultuous time. So, the nation was looking to a president who would not only calm tensions overseas, but also calm tensions at home. And with that, we get something called the Pentagon Papers. So Daniel Ellsberg, he worked for the Defense Department, and he gave secret papers to the New York Times that showed the government was really questioning the war. The president was making decisions without Congress, and it wasn't just Nixon, it was several presidents. They would mislead Congress as to what they were actually doing. So these were covert bombings, these were secret missions, they were falsifying reports coming in from overseas. So the New York Times, when they publish this, a lot of American citizens are starting to lose faith in the government. And they're saying, well, if the government isn't 100% about this war, we're certainly not 100%. So maybe it would be in our best interest to kind of pull away a little bit. So with all this happening, Nixon is reelected. Okay, so his platform includes peace with honor. So what does that mean exactly? Peace with honor. So it means we stop fighting, but we're going to do it honorably and end the war. But not for everybody, just the American aspect of the war. So he negotiated terms to bring the U.S. out of the war, but not end the war. So it was essentially, look, you guys can keep fighting, but we're leaving. Okay, North Vietnam would soon take over South Vietnam as soon as the Americans left. So obviously, this was not particularly effective. But Nixon did have several accomplishments that were of note. So the first was détente. So this was relaxing international tensions. So basically, particularly with Russia, we don't have to constantly be at the brink of war. And with that came a thaw in the Cold War. He actually visited Moscow, and he improved relations with China, which was monumental at the time because China was a completely untapped resource for the American business aspect. He appointed several Supreme Court justices, enacted revenue sharing between federal and states, so all of the money that the federal government was making, now they would start sharing more with the states. And he promoted affirmative action, which would give minorities a little bit more of access to certain jobs and rights. So with that, Nixon would ride off into the sunset as an amazing president right up there with Lincoln. Nothing else more to say about Nixon. However, we all know that's not true. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Watergate. So Watergate was what could be defined as a third-rate burglary. Watergate was named after the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and it began as a passing newspaper article and evolved into one of the biggest presidential scandals in American history. So in 1972, we'll say Nixon's re-election committee was worried about Nixon's re-election. Okay, so what they did was they sent people to the Watergate Hotel, and there was a robbery that took place. And what happened to also be located in the Watergate Hotel was the Democratic Party's offices. The goal of the men who broke into the hotel was to plant listening devices and phones to spy on Democrats' conversations. So what exactly were they saying about Nixon? What did they have on Nixon? How could they formulate a plan to combat whatever the Democrats were actually saying? And everything would come to light because something like this you can't really keep in the dark. So Washington Post reporter keeps digging, Bob Woodward. So he is digging. None of this sounds right. How could there possibly have been a break-in at such an important hotel? What exactly happened? What do you mean somebody broke into the Democratic Party's offices? And a source from the Republican Party, nicknamed Deep Throat, would help reporters to uncover that the burglary was in fact Nixon's re-election campaign. And so naturally, this all comes out via the Washington Post, and all parties involved deny it. Now, as with anything in this situation, you deny, but if you break one person, it breaks everything wide open. And in the case of the Watergate scandal, that was the exact issue. So Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein later on, they keep reporting on it. The officials get involved. Somebody breaks, and everything comes to light. So, May 1973, Senate begins hearings on this Watergate scandal, and they want to know exactly what the president knew. What does Richard Nixon know in regard to this break-in? They learned that there's a secret taping system in the president's office that recorded conversations. So they said, what better way to know if Nixon knew anything about it than to check these tapes? They want to hear those tapes. Nixon refused. He cited executive privilege. He said president's conversations are private. Courts tried to force Nixon to hand over the tapes, but he refused. Because, let's face it, if he is refusing, there's something pretty damning on those tapes. So what else could happen at this time to make things worse? Vice President Spiro Agnew was charged with taking bribes while governor of Maryland, and he resigned. So maybe the vice president involved in a little scandal of his own maybe takes some heat off of Nixon, maybe not. So Nixon gets to appoint his own vice president, because if the vice president resigns, it's up to the president to appoint their own vice president. And he appoints leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, Gerald Ford, as his new vice president. So Agnew's out, Ford is in, and that brings us back to Nixon. Some of the tapes do get released, not the most damning parts, but the Supreme Court ruled that his executive privilege did not apply in this scenario, and he had to turn over the tapes. So if you remember, we go back to a little bit earlier, Nixon appointed a lot of these people. So he has to turn over the tapes. The tapes revealed his attempt to cover up the Watergate break-in, meaning Nixon knew about it pretty bad. And after hearing the tapes, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Nixon. So impeachment doesn't mean that you are booted from office. All it means is you think of the House of Representatives as a grand jury, and then Senate is the actual jury. They conduct the trial, and they're the ones that decide your fate. So rather than facing this trial, Nixon will resign on August 9th, 1974. So what happens now? You have the elected vice president resigning. You have the president resigning. And now we have Gerald Ford, the only president who did not run as either vice president or president, is now our president. He appoints Nelson Rockefeller as his VP, and Ford announces our long national nightmare is over, and he would pardon Richard Nixon, meaning he would never face charges for his role in Watergate. Now, that in itself could be a whole nother lecture presentation, because should Ford have pardoned him? Maybe. Should he have forced him to stand trial? Maybe. Did he do the American public justice by not letting them put him on trial? Probably not. Did he save the country from this nightmare that he called it? Possibly. But the question is, do you protect the president? That's not for me to decide. That is for the American public to decide. But again, they did not have a vote in this whole thing, and Gerald Ford would take that right from them. So the question is, Nixon, yes, he did something horribly wrong. He did something horribly illegal. He was not put on trial for it. Does that make him an ineffective president? Not necessarily. Does it make him a bad president? Makes him a bad person. Does it make him just one of the presidents who got caught? This is really open for interpretation. And a deep analysis, which has been conducted by many historians, was Nixon essentially a bad president for this? So this obviously would lead into an assignment, which I would normally have posted, but I think that's really up for each person to decide on their own. All right, so thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.